Thanks for coming, everyone. Yeah, thanks for coming, everyone. Before I start, I spent a lot of my time in the oil and gas industry as a business analyst and in strategic planning. And one of the techniques we used was from Boston Consulting Group in strategic planning. And what we're looking at in strategic planning is looking forward, trying to identify what trends, patterns, or risks that are facing the business, as it was at the time. And then in response to that, come up with a series of options and how to deal with it. So applying that technique here, I've been thinking hard about our future food supplies. And the latest news from the USA has been a little bit alarming. So according to the states, it seems like a carbon containment has been cancelled. POTUS has declared that we must drill, baby, drill. And then he just 2 weeks ago, he announced he's going to restore coal-fired power generation in the States. Big Oil have cancelled a lot of their decarbonization programs and alternative energy programs, concentrating on their core business, which is making money out of oil. And in January this year, we hit 1.74. And all the indications are this year is going to be a tad warmer. So that kind of makes me think, what are the risks that we're going to be facing? Scotland's a really small country, but the risks we face to our food supply is we're starting to see yield reduction across the world. And these are coming from degradation of land. Climate change and climate warming is causing yield reductions. And then we're losing crops from increasing storm events. And I'll go into these in a little bit more detail. The current projections for population by 2050, it's only 25 years away, is 9.7 billion. That's a 21% increase in the population. They all need to be fed. The other backdrop is we're seeing trends now developing geopolitical supply risks, where countries are taking a harder look at what they do with their homegrown food. And if all of these things come to pass, questions we have to ask ourselves, can we feed ourselves? And can we afford to buy the food that's going to be available? So those are, if you like, are the risks that we have evidence of. And what we'll do now is we'll look at some of the evidence, the indicators of this evidence going forward. 54% of the food consumed in the UK is produced here. That means the balance, 46%, is imported. Depending on which figures, it's anywhere between 50 and 60% of our food is imported. 56% of the processed food that's already cooked is imported. 70% comes from Europe. And from non-EU countries, there's 30%. Is where it's coming from. Of our unprocessed food, which is corn, maize, oils, vegetables, fruit, 60% is imported into the country and from all over the world. And you'll see it, you go to the supermarket, your tomatoes are coming from Spain, your fruit and vegetables can be coming from Thailand, from South Africa, from all over the world. We are totally dependent on our food supplies from other countries, which is fine if those food supplies continue to be available. So now we'll take a look at some of the issues that we're facing is land degradation. So what are the indicators of land degradation? Well, according to United Nations Convention on Climate Desertification, when I studied this first back in about 2018, they said at that time it was 33% of the land had been degraded. This year, it's now 40%. There seems to be no reversal of land degradation, with one exception, and that's China. I'm not going to go into detail what China's doing, but they're doing some pretty amazing stuff. In terms of food supply, the arable land per capita, per person across the world in 1970 was 0.38 hectares. Today is 0.18 hectares. So we're trying to feed ourselves on less than half of the available land per person. At the same time as land, what's happening is the impact on the soil itself is reducing the production capacity, and also the nutritional value of the land is declining. And some years ago, I read a report which said the nutritional value of food grown on UK farmland over the past 50 years has declined between 25 and 75% over that period. And the reasons for that is we're destroying the soil. The soil itself is not as healthy as it used to be. It doesn't have the same biome. It doesn't have the same microbes and soil fauna. So cause of land degradation across the world, soil erosion is often through overplowing, deforestation. It's going to be degraded by wind and water erosion, and we're seeing it rising floods and rising winds. Deforestation is hellbent, and ironically, a lot of the land degradation is happening in Brazil. Is the deforestation is necessary to replace the land that they've deforested and brought in agricultural production. They don't look after it and they wreck it, so it's no longer fertile. So then you have to chop down another tranche. At least those that are farming it, others they're just destroying it for beef. Chemical pollution. We are hell-bent on overloading the soils with as much fertilizer as we can. And the reason for the fertilizer is to try and boost the productive capacity of the land. And the use of pesticides, when we do that, we might decrease the insects, we might improve the production, but we're causing havoc to the soil itself and all of the creatures in the mycelium that grows underneath the soil. And the importance of the soil culture and the soil health to plant life is now being recognized. It's vital. An increase in urbanization, and it's scary when you look at the extent of the populations across the world and the amount of land they're taking up. Regional impacts, we're seeing desertification in Africa, across Asia, but actually the Chinese have got a massive program of reforestation and de-desertification, and they are doing huge stuff, and they've arrested it, and they're beginning to see massive recovery of desert lands in China. So South America, deforestation is continuing madly, and it seems to be little a reduction. And then intensive farming is called all sorts of issues with soil compaction and nutritional loss across Europe. So I can't see it. Can we use that?
Everybody online, the computer driving this meeting has just been shut out, closed from the meeting. So there's going to be an interruption until we get it back on into the meeting. Sorry about that. I don't want to stay co-host.
Okay. So yield trend.
Just before we start, could someone online just tell us if you can see everything okay?
Yep, it's working fine.
Right. Sorry about that. That was my fault entirely. I pushed the wrong button. So here the estimates of yield reduction or predictions of on current behavior is yield reductions that we could face is by 2050, global crop yields could decline by 25%. This is against a population that's going to rise by 21%. There'll be disparities geographically, and some areas will gain slightly, but for the most part, most regions are going to fail. When we factor in climate changes to food production, here are the predictions. If it gets too warm, we can see a reduction from heat stress, so we can a reduction in the ability of the grains to fill out. And that's at 30 to 35 degrees. It reduces the ability of the grains to grow. It can shorten the growing season, so plants will grow a lot faster. So the growing season is to be shorter, and if it's a shorter period, it's going to put on less bulk. And in some cases, they're concerned that extreme heat can cause sterility in the plants, which will reduce will limit their grain production. Sort of impacts that people are concerned about. Now, remember what we're doing is we're investigating strategic possibilities. What might happen if we don't do anything? So 10 to 30% loss in yields from maize, which is a pretty major one. In rice production, higher temperatures can, again, result in losses in production. Soybeans and potatoes, they're also vulnerable to heat stress, and they're expecting to see yield declines in Brazil and in China. Now, we're also seeing changes in rainfall patterns, and the change in rainfall patterns has been fairly evident this past 5 or 6 years. Droughts and water shortages will hit Africa, South Asia, and the USA. We're seeing more frequent floods, particularly in Bangladesh, and if the oceans do begin to rise, vast tracts of nearshore land is going to become submerged and be lost to production. We've seen the last couple of years is massive impact across England in their lands which have got flooded. So last year, massive amounts of crops were lost due to floods. Spain lost a lot of their production. We're seeing shifts in the monsoons and sees unpredictability in rainfall. And when these things occur, all of the mechanisms of land degradation get exacerbated. So if you get mass floods, you get increasing soil erosion because of that massive rainfalls. So all of these things are linked and interconnected. Extreme weather events are occurring, and we've seen that. Hurricane cyclones, their frequency is without doubt rising. And the severity of those storms are increasing, and much of southern states in the USA have had massive hits. Hailstorms and wildfires. Well, we saw the wildfires in the States last year. In South America, we're seeing more fires across Europe, and we're seeing more fires even across the UK. And shockingly, last week there were fires in Grampian. which is unheard of for this time of year. Here's what the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction says. Between 1980 and 1999, there were 4,200 major disasters. In a similar period, following 20 years, it increased by 74%. So the indicators are there that something is happening that we should take cognizance of. Heat waves and wildfires have tripled since 1980, and floods and heavy rainfall have more than doubled. Hurricanes and cyclones has doubled since the 1980s. And droughts have increased by 29%. And there's another phenomenon which is beginning to become apparent now, and that's a whiplash, environmental whiplash. So when you get a storm, when you get a series of floods, they're very often followed by whiplash, which is a protracted period of drought. So you've got a storm causing havoc, and then coming after that is a whiplash in extreme weather and drought. So those events are beginning to increase in frequency. Now, I spoke about governments potentially trying to do something about this, and government priorities are developing, particularly across the developing countries. They're increasingly looking to feed their own. And export restrictions have already begun. And when you look at the international food trade, who profits the most out of international food trade? It's not the producer and it's not the consumer. And I think you're going to see governments are going to start asking, what we're going to do here. So the early indicators are India. They've already restricted basmati rice, non-basmati rice, and sugar. The reasons are to protect their supplies for their own people, but also if they export their food, there's less food available in country, which feeds inflation. So they want to keep control of inflation. So let's look after our own before we start looking after other countries. Kazakhstan, wheat and flour export limits have been occurring. Why? The reasons are they've got extensive droughts and they're concerned about local food security. That's straining the supplies across Central Asia and surrounding regions, and by default, it will affect imports to our country. Indonesia, palm oil export bans, and again, there's a recurring theme, inflation control. They're getting lower yields through environmental impacts, or in the case of Indonesia, El Nino weather effects. So they're trying to contain inflation and maintain supplies for themselves. And a similar thing is going on in Turkey with our onions and potatoes, and there's hardly a dish we cook here without onions. And if you look at the source of them, most of them are coming from abroad. In summary, as a strategist, I'm looking out to the future. And bear in mind that China and Japan have a 20-year strategic planning horizon. Our strategic horizon seems to be 3 to 5 years. So we're seeing climate change, droughts, floods, heat waves. Last year, Spain's olive oil yield was down 50%. Food inflation is starting to creep in, and countries are starting to try and take measures to constrain that. And prioritizing feeding of their own people. So what do we do? Business as usual, which seems to be the trajectory that we're on? Or should we put more emphasis on home food production? By definition, if we produce the food at home, we will reduce our carbon miles. And if you look at the carbon costs of all of the 50% or so of the food that we're importing, it's massive. And a lot of the carbon that's emitted is on these big tankers going across or aircraft. So reduce the carbon miles by producing at home. And I think at this point, we can pass on to Ruth, who's got a slightly more exciting story. Whilst that's been quite depressing, what's in the pipeline is much more interesting and exciting for us.
Thank you
Okay.
very